screen, and hopefully you can all see that. So yes, thank you very much. My name's Ellie Graham. I'm a coastal archaeologist, and I'm looking at threatened heritage and developing digital and remote sensing techniques to help us research, manage and communicate coastal heritage and the threats it faces from climate change, and using the heritage as a vehicle to communicate some of the climate change impacts, and using that to engage people both with their heritage but also with those issues and the global challenge of climate change. So I'm currently doing a PhD at the University of Aberdeen as part of the Quadrat DTP, really specifically looking at using drones and developing methodologies. But I was formerly employed at the University of St Andrews with the Scape Trust doing similar work. So I'm going to be speaking about both aspects of that today. So this is Scotland. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. We've got a very long coastline. It's the second longest coastline in Europe. It's about 11,000 kilometres long. And since the end of the last ice age, the centre of Scotland has been undergoing isostatic readjustment. So the centre of the country has been rebounding up from the weight of the ice, but the edges, particularly at the islands, have actually been dropping as the centre of the country rises. So those areas particularly have actually been experiencing relative sea level rise really throughout the period of human activity there. Meanwhile, recent tide gauge data is showing increasing frequency of floods and higher tides. So isostatic uplift in the centre of the country is no longer mitigating the impacts of sea level rise around the world. So all areas of Scotland are now experiencing relative sea level rise. So more of the country is being impacted, and we're going to experience that more dramatically. Meanwhile, all of that's exacerbated by climate change, changing patterns and increasing frequency of extreme events. So offshore platforms in the North Sea are already recording higher wave heights. So those rising sea levels are going to be further exacerbated by that. And of course, with these as some of the impacts of climate change that we're dealing with, all of this is only going to get worse. So we're going to get a warmer, wetter climate in Scotland with a higher frequency of extreme events, so increased risk of flooding from all sources, accelerating sea level rise and increasing slope instability, which is going to be increasing erosion. And of course, we've got varying projections for what that means depending on different emission scenarios. But in Scotland, our particular issue is that over 20% of our coastline looks like this: soft, low-lying and sandy, so particularly vulnerable to some of those impacts of those manifestations of climate change. But because the coast in Scotland has always been the attractive place to live, it's where the fertile land is, it's got access to marine resources and opportunities for transport, communication and trade, it's always been a favoured place for settlement, which means that a lot of our heritage is in these areas and so is especially vulnerable to some of those climate-driven coastal impacts. So just as an illustration, this is a place called Balashare. It's a small island off the west coast of North Uist. It's in a very exposed location and is typical of the sandy environment that characterises quite a lot of that part of our coast. And it's also a very rich archaeological landscape. There is an extensive prehistoric settlement there in that area highlighted in the yellow circle. So just to illustrate both the extent of the threat but also how difficult it is to manage, this is the coastline as it was mapped in 1946 aerial photos. That's the same area in 1992, and you can see there's been little change really in the intervening 50 years. However, in 2005, a very dramatic storm hit that coast and we lost 50 metres of land in a single night, which completely destroyed the entire site. So that's really the scale of the issue that we're dealing with and the urgency of the threat in some places. So in recognition of that, Scotland's lead historic environment body, then Historic Scotland, now Historic Environment Scotland, set up the Scape Trust, with a remit to research Scotland's coastal archaeological resource, particularly where it was most vulnerable and threatened by erosion and coastal processes. So the first step was gathering data just to quantify the resource. So from 1996 to 2010, a series of coastal zone assessment surveys were carried out, which covered between 35 and 40% of the coast. That's the areas in blue on this map. It was really targeting the most vulnerable areas in a series of 29 individual survey tranches. They were carried out by professional commercial archaeologists, and they recorded the geology, the geomorphology and erosion status of the coast, and also recorded 12,000 archaeological sites around the coast. But about 3,000 of those carried recommendations made by the surveyors for further action, which really was too many to be feasible. It was like an overwhelming problem. So that actually became a barrier for taking further action. Also, there were other issues in that the data was gathered over a very long period of time. With a rapid pace of change in the coastal zone, the data was out of date very quickly, and there were inconsistencies across the different survey areas. So it was very difficult to get a sort of national overview of the condition of the resource. So we carried out a desk-based assessment to turn it really into a management resource, looking at analysing, digitising and standardising all that data at a national level, carrying out a GIS analysis to look at vulnerability, and that produced a prioritised data set of about 1,000 sites. But it highlighted that the first thing to do was to get an update on the current condition of those sites. So the Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk project was born. It ran from 12 to 16, and it worked with the public to address this and integrated communities into the management of our coastal archaeology. That prioritised data set was put online interactive map portals and a simple mobile recording app that volunteers could use to submit surveys, add photos and create new site records. Because the second part of the resource very much is the communities. This was the approach we took. It was working with volunteers all over Scotland to gather that data. It was very much a crowdsourcing approach we were using to take that step of updating records and condition checking sites. Of course, working with communities brings so many advantages. They know the coast, they know the history, they can respond rapidly after storms, but also working with them brings in a diversity of perspectives. So it adds depth and other local knowledge that doesn't always make it into historic environment data sets. So that was underpinned by training, some of which was indoors, but was very much focused on the practicalities of coastal survey, recognising and recording sites and really thinking about site threats. But it was very much focused on the technology and the digital recording tools. It was very much about democratising participation through using that accessible digital technology. So as volunteers and groups grew confidence, they went out and carried out the surveys independently, and they gathered out a huge amount of data for us. But as I've said, it also had implications for the type and quality of data that we gathered, bringing in that sort of diversity of perspectives and local knowledge that's embedded within communities but isn't always considered at a national level. So we then carried out an analysis of everything that was submitted through the website and app, looking at observational data as submitted by the volunteers, the description, their recommendations and their photos. But we also mapped that against areas of erosion, against models of coastal susceptibility and vulnerability from various GIS analyses that have been done. So it's very much about on-the-ground observational data from the volunteers. And they achieved a huge amount. Almost all the priority sites were seen. They generated thousands of records, lots of new sites, and many thousands of photos. And from that, we've created a reprioritised data set of the most vulnerable sites. They're really a snapshot with an up-to-date condition of the coastal archaeological resource around Scotland. But what that has underlined is the need for ongoing management and investigation, improving our understanding of these sites. So it's really given us a list of 145 of the most vulnerable, most urgent priorities that have the greatest potential to add new information and knowledge. It's very much focused on the urgency of the threat these sites are facing. And all of that reprioritised data set was based on crowdsourced data. The approach we took incorporated social value, brought in that range of voices into judgments of priority and significance. But dissemination of knowledge is a thread that sort of runs all the way through Scape's philosophy and the project, from the core values to the design of the project, data gathering, fieldwork and consultation on priorities. So the project really acted as a conduit of crowdsourced data into heritage management decisions and policy. But it also engaged communities with the data, with the heritage, but also the threat and the issue from the ground up. That participation sort of engendered engagement, but illustrated the threat. It was very visceral and tangible for people to see the impact of coastal erosion and climate change on places that they value, that are very important for their sense of place and identity. But it's also important, of course, to do something with that data and take action at some of these locally valued vulnerable sites to rescue something from them before they're lost. So the other thing we did with the project was to actually undertake action at 17 locally valued sites nominated by local communities and investigated them further. And that's the next step for me. As part of my PhD, I'm going to be building upon that, doing more at some of these sites and develop remote sensing techniques to further investigate them, track erosion and coastal change, and to monitor the site's condition, really to help us manage individual sites, but also manage the network of sites all over the coast, and think about them as places where we can start to observe, monitor, and understand the processes and impacts of climate change on our coast. So I'm starting with that reprioritised data set and taking a selection of them forward as case study sites to look at in more detail and apply some of these digital techniques. So I've got a distributed network of sites all over the country in a variety of environments. Most of these sites are places that have already been highlighted by local communities as significant, but they're not yet fully understood. We know they're vulnerable, but they're also very locally valued. So I've deliberately selected sites that have existing engagement with an existing high profile that I can develop and build upon, just to maintain those community networks and involve local people in the fieldwork and in the ground truthing. So just to take you on a quick sort of tour around Scotland to show you some of them. The first one is Balashare, which is the site I showed you at the beginning, where we saw the impacts of the 2005 storm. So we did actually run an excavation there between 2006 and 2010, which revealed 2 complex Atlantic wheelhouses, but there's a lot more extensive remains in the hinterland. And we've had an ongoing programme of community monitoring that I'll be looking to incorporate into my fieldwork. Then down in the Borders, this is a promontory fort, a Tudor fort built by the English during the Rough Wing and subsequently reoccupied by the French. It's a very different environment, but again, there's a huge amount of community engagement here. There's a lot of support and championing of the site. Our involvement there has been very much driven by local enthusiasm. So we've already run a programme of aerial survey, community survey, and installation of on-site interpretation. It's a site that's not considered by professionals to be susceptible, as it's on high rocky cliffs, but the community are recording and reporting a lot of collapse and erosion of the fortification. So I want to use the digital tools to understand that better. Then in Fife, again, a very different site. This is a low rocky coast. It's a site of 18th century salt pans where local coal was used to boil seawater to create salt. This one actually has a real sort of heritage tourism angle. It's an amenity on the Fife coastal path. It's very locally valued. Again, it's not deemed to be eroding, but it clearly and visibly is. So we need to understand that process better and do something about the loss of this valued heritage. And then finally, the last one I want to illustrate a different environment. It's a salt marsh site on the Inner Forth estuary, an intertidal salt marsh, which is a very complex post-medieval maritime, industrial and agricultural landscape now buried in the accreting salt marsh, but it's again very locally valued for its historic associations. There's been extensive community research in there, including an excavation that we carried out in 2017 and 18. But changing sea levels and coastal dynamics are threatening and obscuring the site and the remains there. So just to illustrate the methodology I'll be using, this is one we did earlier. This is up in Shetland. It's a project I was involved with Scape just last year. So this is a heavily eroded Iron Age broch, where I carried out an aerial survey using the drone, created a 3-dimensional structure from motion model. Used that to create highly detailed 3-dimensional models, ortho photos, and sorry, I think my computer is possibly frozen. 3-dimensional ortho photos, as well as on the ground traditional earthwork survey techniques that were carried out by volunteers. Used that as the basis of GIS analysis, used historic maps to compare across past coastal change, project rates of loss, and calculate what that meant for future loss under different climate emission scenarios in 30 years and in 80 years. And all of that, again, was combined with ground truthing, community monitoring, and hopefully we'll also carry out repeat surveys to keep on top of that and see what changes. All of those models are going to be shared on online platforms, Sketchfab and Gigapan. Those repeat surveys will show change, and the models will hopefully help people to understand and engage with the process of loss and the threats these sites are facing from the impacts of climate change on the coast. Because it very much is about incorporating communities at every stage, because it's not just about dissemination, but about engagement using heritage as a shared resource. bringing in a diversity of voices to help to contribute to managing this issue, which makes for more robust management of this very vulnerable resource. The objective isn't just to understand the sites better, but to understand the loss, to plan interventions and mitigation strategies for individual sites, but also to extrapolate further across all coastal heritage, develop methodologies to research and manage it as an overall resource, but really using them as a network of nodal observation points where we can start to understand coastal erosion, the impacts of climate change. And by observing those impacts, I'm hoping that communities can be more deeply engaged with the impacts of climate change, taking climate action and engaging with the global challenge that is climate change. So thank you very much. And if you'd like to get in touch, my contact details are there. I'd be delighted to discuss it further.